Thank you very much, everybody, for coming along. My name's Rory Collins, and I'm the head of the Nuffield Department of Population Health. Nick suggested I should explain why a department that's interested in population health research and implementing better health in the public would host an event on truth in the media. And the obvious reason is that there is so much misinformation about health in the media. Perhaps the most notorious example is that of Andrew Wakefield and MMR and autism, published in The Lancet in 1998 with a press conference that led to a worldwide scare about the risks of vaccination against measles, mumps, and rubella. It took 12 years before that paper was retracted, and the GMC struck off Andrew Wakefield. In between, in 2002, the BBC Panorama programme had a very sympathetic programme about Wakefield, which helped to support that. And what we saw was a large reduction in vaccination rates, increases in a disease that had been largely eradicated, measles, and it continues to be a problem. Only last year, Robert Kennedy Jr. and Robert De Niro offered a $100,000 prize to whoever who could prove that the MMR vaccine was safe. And in fact, apparently Trump had been considering having Robert Kennedy Jr., an anti-vaxxer, run an inquiry into its safety. So far, that hasn't happened. But the problem, I think, is it took 12 years for it to be retracted, and when it was retracted on a technicality. He was struck off for not declaring conflicts of interest, not for scientific misconduct. A little bit like Al Capone getting sent to Alcatraz for not paying his tax. In Al Capone's case, he died of syphilis in Alcatraz. So far, Andrew Wakefield prospers. And in fact, what has happened is, by not dealing with the problem rapidly, it has become an increasingly big problem. So the second reason why I'm interested from a health point of view was that there's lots talked about fake news, about what it is, about the impact it has. But what I found special about Nick's book was that he tried to understand the causes of it. That there had been a change in the ownership of the media, moving from people who were interested in news to people who were interested in making money. Cutting the journalists, cutting the checking, reducing the quality control. I think he refers to it as churnalism, with press releases just being put out there without the ability to check them. And from the less obvious perspective of health, in dealing with disease, it really helps to understand the causes, to prevent it and to treat it. And again, with disease, typically, the most effective way of dealing with a disease is not through treatment, it's through prevention. If we want to deal with lung cancer, it's getting people not to start smoking, getting them to stop smoking, not to try and treat their lung cancer. And so I'm interested in whether the same thing is true of dealing with fake news. And it was for that reason that I wanted to ask Nick to come and talk to us, and Alan to talk about how one deals with the problem, particularly in the internet age. This book was published in 2008, but things have clearly not got better. So Alan and Nick, thank you very much. Okay.
I should just briefly explain that Nick and I have known each other a very long time. We both joined The Guardian on the same day in 1979, and he stayed being a reporter, really, and I sat behind a desk. But we did a lot together in the last 10 years while I was editing The Guardian, and I think Nick is one of my great journalistic heroes. And did amazing work including, but not only, 7 years on the incredible story about phone hacking, which led to these 2 books. One, Flat Earth News, and what was the other one called?
He's read it, he's memorized it, he's read it to his children.
It was a really good book.
I can't remember either.
I can't remember.
No,
it was
it's
a good
called
book
Hack
anyway.
Attack.
So I'm going to. Nick wants to make this a conversation, but he's a better talker than I am. So I will mainly ask.
Mind you, he has no experience in interviewing people.
So I'm mainly going to ask him stuff, but he may ask me stuff too, and it's not at all artificial. We thought this was going to be a pub, incidentally, above a pub. We had no idea we were going to be here. And I think probably because this is such an enormous topic, and there are so many clever people thinking about the sort of social media bit of it, which is obviously huge. But I think maybe the most important bit that we can talk about tonight is actually the failings of mainstream media. But we will end up talking about social media as well.
Okay.
So what do you understand what do you understand by the term fake news?
Okay, so first of all, I think the expression fake news is unhelpful. It's a cliche. Okay, it's new, but it's still a cliche. Cliches are dangerous because they denote shortcuts of thinking as well as shortcuts of language. So I don't even know what it means. At best, it means nothing, and it isn't clear. At worst, it means something to do with hostile agencies, probably Russian, fabricating stories on social media. And it doesn't begin to capture what's going on. I should say, okay, we've known each other nearly 40 years. The weird thing is we've never had a crossword, but we might try tonight for these people to have an argument. So my opening bid would be this. It ain't about fake news. That's too tiny and muddled. What's happened is that in the last 5 or 10 years, collectively, we crossed the line into an era of information chaos. So it's much, much bigger than fake news tells you. And you have now all kinds of different channels of communication flooded with falsehood, pretending to be truth. And it pours through these channels of communication and out into public policy, government policy, into popular culture, personal behavior. And it's a big, big thing. And because it affects all of that alarmingly long list of problems that are so frightening, climate change, Middle Eastern war, Islamist terrorism, Russian nuclear missiles, Chinese expansionism, all of it is polluted with misinformation, and all of the reaction to it is equally polluted. Could you live with something as apocalyptical as that?
That's a good start, yeah.
I know you're agreeing with me.
I remember I gave a talk in Sheffield about 2005, before Facebook and social media really got going. And then the thing that worried me was a world without news, because it seemed to me we were losing the ability to finance what you and I have done all our lives. And the local newspapers would die first. Well, that turned out to be true. They're dying. And then eventually it would reach other forms of news. But in fact, what's actually happened is become worse than that. It's not that there's no news. There's too much news. But it's distinguishing between what is true and what is untrue.
Okay.
And I was in this theatre the other night, 2 nights ago, when the professor at the Oxford Internet Institute, Philip Howard, was saying that they can now measure in the United States the proportion of true information to fake information is now 1-to-1 in America on social media channels. In Britain, it's 1-to-4 in the right way, so 4 true to 1 untrue. In Germany, 4-to-1, France, 7-to-1. But that seems to me a really frightening statistic, 1-to-1.
It is. I still don't think it captures the badness of it. Let's try and fill in a big picture. If we think of these channels of communication being polluted by misinformation, there are at least 3 big pumps, so to speak, working away in the background. So the first, very significant, but actually the least in order, if we start with the small and build up big, is propaganda. Now, with all of these 3 pumps I want to talk about, none of them is new, but all of them, you might not agree with this, has been made enormously much more destructive by the internet. I think we're getting to the point with the internet where it's a bit like nuclear missiles. We think that was very clever of us to invent it, but maybe we would have been better off not doing it. Agree with that?
I don't agree with that, but keep going.
So propaganda is very old. Propaganda is organizations, probably military and intelligence agencies, but not necessarily, deliberately fabricating false stories, masquerading as true stories in order to achieve some political, diplomatic, or military objective. That's propaganda. And you can see, if you look at it since 1945, it's moved through various very interesting phases. So, courtesy of two committees on Capitol Hill, one chaired by Frank Church, you remember that senator, and another by Otis Pike, and some really good journalism, some of it done by Carl Bernstein of Watergate fame. We know a lot about the propaganda machine that was in place during the Cold War. And it's fair to say, on the basis of all that evidence, that during those years, the biggest news organization in the world was not the Associated Press, which is what the official answer would be. It was the CIA. The Associated Press Agency had reporters in about 120 countries. Well, there are about 200 countries in the world. Whereas the CIA had media assets in every single country in the planet and was using them to pump out propaganda, fabricated stories. As a single example, you might remember the Pope being shot in the Vatican by a crazy Turk who belonged to a group called the Grey Wolves. Well, the CIA used their network of newspapers to put out false stories connecting him to Bulgarian intelligence. It was the Russians what did it. Now, when the Cold War ended, that vast apparatus of official misinformation had its budget cut, and it died away. And then, September 2001, an enormous new structure was created. And I had this weird experience when I was researching this book, that because the whole world had been Thatcherized and privatized, there's this conference in London of spooks and military people from all the NATO countries coming to discuss what they now call strategic communications. It's what you and I call propaganda. And they were selling tickets. So I filled in a form. There was a nice guy in British military intelligence who was helping me. He pointed out this thing was there with its door open. So I filled in this form saying, Nick Davies, Guardian, which sounds like a security company, paid £1,000. Actually, Alan Rusbridger paid £1,000. I got it on expenses. And I was suddenly in the middle of this conference. And after about half an hour, they suddenly realized that there was a journo, an awful old hack in their midst. And they stopped everything. What the fuck's going on? And I said, well, you can't throw me out. I've got a contract with you. I've paid money. It would be a breach of contract for you to chuck me out. So they said, oh. So I was allowed to stay, and I was allowed to identify the people who were there. And I was allowed to say what was said on the understanding that I didn't hook the quotes up to the individuals. Because if I'd gone beyond that, I think they were going to kill me. Some of them were, that type. But so this was really, really interesting because these were very clever people. There's a lot of senior US military people, NATO people. They've got at least 2 degrees. These are not thickos with tattoos. And their job was to manipulate mainstream media. And the more you listened to them, the more you could see how easy it was. And I tracked some of it in that book. There was fascinating stuff around Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, who wasn't the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq. He existed, and he was an extremely unpleasant man. But he was essentially a propaganda vehicle to convey the idea that the insurrection by Iraqis was, in fact, the work of foreign fighters. The most important thing about Zarqawi is that he's a Jordanian. He's not an Iraqi. So we consistently blame everything on this Jordanian. It's foreign fighters. Just as a single example of how easy it is to get away with that. The first time he really surfaced publicly was when Colin Powell made that extraordinary presentation to the UN Security Council in February 2003 to justify the invasion. An extraordinary tissue of lies. And in that he talked about how Saddam Hussein was linked to al-Qaeda. And the concrete evidence of this was that this very senior al-Qaeda guy, Zarqawi, had been injured in Afghanistan and had been operated on in Baghdad by Saddam's surgeons, who'd saved his life, although they'd had to remove one of his legs. Well, a few months later, when those poor guys in orange jumpsuits were being beheaded in front of the camera, that too, it was Zarqawi with the black mask and the knife. And it showed you how good Saddam Hussein's surgeons were, because he'd sprouted a second leg. But it was easy. Nobody in the press said, hang on a minute, I can count up to 2. There's something wrong with this story. What were you going to say?
Well, that's all fascinating, but I suppose to bring it...
That was patronizing, did you think? Yeah.
You've had 40 years of being patronized by me. You can take it. So why is it so easy? Why
Okay,
if
well,
you've
we'll
got
come
all
to
these,
that.
well, come to that now. So why have you got,
Okay.
the magnificent estate that is the press? Why is it so easy to fool them?
Okay. I've got one more line on propaganda, a single sentence, which is that once you've got social media, it's clear that the distribution capacity of that machine is bigger than ever. So if, looking back to the Cold War, it was the biggest news machine in the world, introduce this thing after September 2001, it's massive, and now it's got social media. It's everywhere, ain't just Russian, plenty of Western stuff. Look at Netanyahu on Iranian nuclear things just the other day. Okay. Okay, let's come to the mainstream media, since he insists. Really, the thesis there is that if you suck the funding out of news organizations, a lot of people may think, well, that's fine. Journalists are rather horrible people. Who cares if they lose their jobs? The real problem is that they become structurally vulnerable to manipulation. So if you ask people outside of our profession, why would newspapers, for example, all over the planet, why would news organizations of every kind tell their readers, viewers, listeners that there were weapons of mass destruction all over Iraq? They tend to come up with conspiracy theories. Well, this is the proprietors who are ideologues. And they lean down from on high and they tell obedient journalists what to write. And these compliant puppets do as they're told. And there is some of that. There are media proprietors who will interfere. But the scale on which they do it is actually very small, very disappointing to the conspiracy theorists. That is not the core of what's going on at all. There's another bunch of people who say, well, it's the advertisers. You need their money, they tell you what to say. Or you need their money and they therefore impose on you some sort of need to comply with capitalist ideology. And that, I mean, that's very, very unusual to find advertisers interfering successfully in newspapers. There was a big row at the Telegraph, it was at HSBC, which caused such Peter Oben resigned, the political correspondent. It's very unusual. The point is that we are structurally likely nowadays to produce falsehood and distortion and propaganda. So I'd have to fill in a few statistics.
Just explain why.
I will. Okay. So when I was researching this book, I raised some money from the Rowntree Foundation, gave it to long-suffering academics in Cardiff, and they did some research for me. Step one, a very crude but interesting piece of research. They went back through the annual reports of all the Fleet Street companies and made some phone calls to track the number of journalists that national newspapers had been employing during the 20 years before we produced the book. Then they went to the newspaper library with tape measures, and they measured the editorial space in newspapers that those journalists were filling as the years went by. And as a crude bottom line figure, what they discovered was that in the current time, the Fleet Street journalists, on average, were filling 3 times as much space as they had been 20 years earlier. That's because the number of journalists in the newsroom had been cut and the output had been increased. Now, if you flip that around and look at it from an operational point of view, what it means is that as a crude average, journalists had only 1/3 of the time they used to have to work on each story. Now, if you take time away from reporters, journalists, it's like taking steel away from the people who manufacture cars. That's what we work with. Time is our primary working asset. Very bad things start to happen if you do this to newsrooms. So then, we get the long-suffering academics at Cardiff to do a study of the output of the 4 quality UK national newspapers over, I think it was a 2-week period, several thousand stories. This was UK home news. So this was Guardian, Times, Independent, Telegraph, and we added the Daily Mail. It isn't a quality newspaper, but it's pretty powerful. So those 5 papers, they're domestic news coverage. And they were actually in the Guardian newsroom, you may remember, because the first question that we wanted to ask of these thousands of stories was, where does the information come from? And specifically, how much of it is actually generated in the way that it should be by reporters running around and asking questions? And so they did an enormous amount of work in the newsroom following up with reporters. And here's what they found. With 8% of the stories, they just couldn't quite be sure where it had come from because it's off-the-record sources. With only 12% of the stories was the material in those stories being generated by reporters asking questions. A tiny, tiny fraction. 80% of the material in those stories was coming from 2 second-hand sources. That's wire copy. The news agencies like the Press Association for the UK Reuters and the AP for the rest of the world. So wire copy, and secondly, the public relations industry. Now, just put those two on one side, and then come for a moment to the second thing that they discovered. They analyzed all those stories in detail, and they said, is there evidence that the central proposition of each of these stories has been checked? Now, the key objective of journalism is to try to tell the truth. Therefore, the key function is checking. That's what we do for a living. So that you know the answer you're going to get, 100%. Or maybe on a bad day, it's going to come down to 90, 80. You know the result they came up with? 12. 12% of those stories showed evidence of being checked. Now, come back to the two primary sources. 80% of the materials coming from these second-hand sources. You look at the wire agencies first. I know a lot of reporters who work for those agencies. They're good people. They're professional. They're hardworking. Some of them are very brave. But then talk to them about what their job is. Is your job to tell the truth? Well, actually, they say it's not. It's not about truth. It's about accuracy. That's a different thing. Our job at an agency is to tell news organizations what people are saying. It is absolutely not our job to start challenging them. That's not what an agency does. The book, for example, quotes Jonathan Grun, who was the head of PA at the time. Accuracy. So if the Prime Minister stands up and says there are weapons of mass destruction all over North Oxford, that is what the good agency will report. It's up to the news organizations to check whether it's true. 12%, remember that. There's a second problem with news agencies, which is that they can't tell you the truth about the world because they don't know it. So AP, for example, at its most powerful, at its wealthiest, had people in only 120 countries. That's 80 countries where they've got nobody. And they are equally powerful in television news. If you look at television news, the number of countries where neither AP nor Reuters has anyone is vast. It includes places like Saudi Arabia, Canada, these are the Congo. These are newsworthy countries. The agencies on whom newspapers rely for their coverage don't have anybody there. A bomb goes off in Riyadh. Reuters get onto the local TV company. Have you got any footage? Yes. Here's 90 seconds. There's a burning car. There's a shoe with blood in it lying in a gutter. Here are some police arriving on the scene. And here's a paragraph which we give to Reuters. And so then we tell you a bomb went off in Riyadh yesterday. Who put it there? Why? What does it mean? We don't know. How can we tell you the truth? We're not there. The agencies aren't there. Even if they are there, they're trying to be accurate, not tell us the truth. It ain't good enough to rely on news agencies. There are some other problems in there, but I can feel Alan twitching. The other more important second-hand source is the PR industry. And this is where, in a sense, the statistic that he just gave you about 50% of US news being fake doesn't get you to the heart of the matter. So, while the money has been sucked out of newsrooms over the years, over on the other side of the line, the public relations industry has been getting more and more powerful. So when we started as reporters a long time ago, 40 years ago, it was rather unusual to come across press officers. I worked on local papers in Devon and Cornwall. If I wanted to do a story with the police, I'd ring a police station and speak to the duty sergeant. At some point, let's say 10 years into that, just about any individual or organization who anticipated that they would have press coverage started to surround themselves with press officers. In the beginning, this was rather a delightful system because the press officers would be kind of retired nobodies who didn't really know what was going on. And so when the reporters called them and said, what's going on, they literally couldn't tell them. They had no idea what the truth was. So that was pretty safe. But then you went into a second phase, symbolized by the work of Alistair Campbell, where organizations realized that it wasn't enough to conceal what they were doing. What they wanted to do was to get out there and manipulate coverage. So the press officer suddenly was moved into the center. And there's Alistair Campbell sitting next to the Prime Minister in the meeting. There's the press officer next to the Chief Constable, to the Chief Executive. And taking part in meetings. No, let's not do that because that won't play well with the press. Actually engineering the decision-making. So they become very significant people. Okay, so there's more and more of these guys. Now, and remember that the PR and the wire are accounting for 80% of the material we're handling. It's huge. If you ask what's wrong with covering PR material, Part of it is that some PR material is lies. Now, people get very upset if you say that, but that is the reality. There's experienced reporters all over this room. We've all had it, that if you put a PR officer in a corner and confront them with uncomfortable information and keep pushing, sooner or later they'll tell you a lie. More than that, there is material put out by the PR industry that's false from the word go. We could give you examples. But beyond that, it isn't a sufficient defense for the PR industry to say that story we gave you yesterday is true. Because you now live in a world where government departments, corporations, trade unions, NGOs, celebrities decide what news organizations are going to tell about them, what stories they're going to write. It isn't enough. So if you were chief press officer of Oxfordshire Police and you come into work in the morning and there on the log there's 2 bits of information. Number 1, last night a senior police officer was so drunk that he had to be sent home in a staff car. Number 2, at noon today, a young police constable will be given a medal because she rescued a baby from a burning building. Now, you have to decide which of these 2 stories to feed out to the local newspapers. And you needn't spend very long about it. It's absolutely obvious, so we'll write. And just understand, the press officer will write the story about the medal and the baby, and will then include a photograph of the smiling police constable, and will then include quotes from the police constable that have never been near the police constable's mouth. And they will go out. And I, for a while, was involved in a campaign to stop a horrible dual carriageway being built through my part of Sussex. And I used to write press releases, and they would come into the local paper verbatim, as I had written them. And that's the experience of lots of PR people across the board. Okay? And this stuff isn't being checked. So can you see how we become structurally likely to produce falsehood and distortion? And the propaganda machine, to a considerable extent, is able to use the same channels that the PR people at the front of the Pentagon or the Ministry of Defense get used to push out what the military and spooks are conjuring up. So you end up with, I think I've said this already, but news organizations who are structurally likely not to be able to tell the truth. Does that help?
That was a very good answer.
Rather long.
It was long, but have a drink. Because I think that we have got to the nub of the problem at the moment. Because in a way, social media, criticizing social media is easy. Mm-hmm. But the defense of journalists is, yes, all that's rubbish, but we're here and we're professionals, and you should pay us because we're going to pump out the truth, and we can distinguish ourselves from what you do because we're over here. And I've just written a book too, which hasn't come out yet, but it's going to come out in September, and it's called Breaking News. That's a pun. And it was looking at the last 20 years of this tension between mainstream news and alternative forms of news. And I thought it was going to be an easy book to write because I thought, well, you know, in the end, it's all about journalism, and journalism is the patch of ground we fight on. But as I was writing it during the Brexit referendum, and looking at the way that Brexit was covered, I thought, well, I know what I want journalists to do is to tell me that case and that case as neutrally as possible, so I can make it my own mind up. And that didn't happen. And then you watched the election of Trump, and increasingly I thought, well, what unites the BBC and the Daily Mail? They seem to be doing completely different things. Fox News, New York Times, completely different ideas of what journalism is. I could ask you about objectivity. I won't, but because I know what your answer is, you're going to say there's no such thing as objectivity. If there was a BBC journalist here, they would say, you're completely wrong. There is such a thing as objectivity. So I taught
lots of BBC journalists. I've subverted the whole thing.
So what you've got is a craft of journalism which the practitioners of the craft can't even agree what it is. At the same time as they're saying, we are the answer to the problem of fake news because what we do is so much better. So the frightening thing about the position, the thing you're describing, we haven't even got onto the economic crisis facing the press, and whether there is a financial model that's going to survive, enable to survive. You're describing really a press that is not up to the job of combating the oceans of fake news that is out there.
Yeah, and I should have said that this book is, first of all, I don't want to sell this book. Alan, if I sold a copy of the book, I get 60 pence. Alan and I are going to pass a hat around afterwards. We think we're going to do much better out of that. So if I refer to the book, it really is just, I've just been reading it. It's not bad. It was written 10 years ago. It's got cobwebs on it. The problem that I was trying to describe that leads to this recycling of unchecked second-hand material, journalism, has, I would say, got much, much worse because of the impact of the internet just breaking the business model on which journalism has survived since the Industrial Revolution. So my guess is it's got much worse. And you can see it from the silly little stories, the PR puffs, the city pages are usually full of them, right up to the big stuff. Could we do a quick Skripal detour? Salisbury, nerve gas.
Yeah, go on, yeah.
Because that's an important story with massive ramifications. Ewan, are you walking out in protest? Oh, okay. I think that Salisbury nerve gas is a very interesting example of collective journalistic failure. I can't find a single newspaper, including The Guardian, doing the job properly. So, and because it's contemporary, just look at it. And this is at the top end of the scale, obviously. So first of all, I don't have any problem in saying that Vladimir Putin and his cronies are gangsters who are ransacking the Russian economy to enrich themselves and their families. The Panama Papers is eloquent on the subject. I don't have any problem in saying that Putin and some of his cronies are murderers. Above my desk at home, I have a picture of Anna Politkovskaya, incredibly brave Russian journalist who was murdered as she came home from a supermarket because she was upsetting the Kremlin with her reporting. But look at what we know about Salisbury, and look at what the newspapers aren't doing because they're engaging in journalism. And the most interesting source on this is the Prime Minister. So a day or two after those two poor people were attacked, she stood up in the House of Commons and she referred to something I'd never heard of before. Most of us haven't. Novichok, this Russian nerve gas. And she says it's Russian. There's only two possible explanations for Novichok being used. Not one, two. And she says the first is the Kremlin ordered a murder. Well, okay, if that turns out to be the truth, by all means, expel 23 diplomats and launch a war of words. But what's this other explanation the Prime Minister thinks could be true? Well, she says the Russians may have lost control of their stockpile of nerve gas. Well, that's interesting, and that's not a new idea. If you go back to the Yeltsin era, the Soviet Union is collapsing, and all sorts of pompous experts in the Ministry of Defense and the Pentagon are saying these Russians are going to lose control of their stockpiles of nuclear, biological, and chemical whatnots. So the first thing that a newspaper does when that is said, because understand, this is not Theresa sitting in the back of a taxi thinking, what shall I say when I get to the House of Commons? This has been worked on by the Joint Intelligence Committee. All the spook agencies have contributed to this. She's saying that because she has to, because it really is a possibility. So you send a reporter out to get close to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and anybody else in the world of academics who knows about chemical weapons and nerve gas, and you find out, is it true that there were leaks from that stockpile? If so, what do we know about who got them? Is it possible that they really did get into the hands of organized crime groups in Russia? Right, hold that there. Now, let's think about Mr. Skripal. And what you're supposed to do if you're a journalist and not a churnalist is you're constantly going to your imagination. Your imagination is your guide. And you're always going, what about, hang on, if A is true, what about B? So, you imagine, you're Vladimir Putin. You're sitting in your office, feet on the desk, a bit of Tchaikovsky in the background. And you think, I might kill someone. Who shall I kill? I know it's going to cause trouble, but I feel like killing someone. Okay, well, there is this guy Skripal. Now, what do we know about Skripal? 2006, we found out that although he was in Russian military intelligence, he was secretly working for MI6. So we killed him. No, we didn't kill him. We arrested him, prosecuted him. When he was convicted, we didn't sentence him to death. We didn't even sentence him to life. We gave him 13 years in prison. And then only 4 years later, when there was that amazing story about the long-term Russian sleepers being found in America, we said, oh, you can have Skripal, if we can have, and 2 or 3 others, and if we can have those 10 back. And since then, 8 years have passed. So why, sitting in my study with the Tchaikovsky, do I decide now to murder Skripal? I'm not saying it wasn't the Kremlin. It may well have been Vladimir, but if it was, there's a chunk missing from the story. Skripal must have been up to something that put him up at Manchester City, not Crystal Palace, in terms of the league table of murder victims. And we don't know what it is. And I haven't found a single report of a single journalist asking this very, very obvious question. But stick with Mr. Skripal. So he gets over here in 2010. MI6 say here's rather a dull red brick house on the edge of a really very dull city. I grew up there, Salisbury. I mean, it's pretty, but there ain't a lot going on. And you can have a stipend, there you are, you'll survive, you can go to Waitrose every so often. What does Skripal do? I mean, I don't know. I want to make it clear, nobody has any right to do what they did to that man and his daughter. But wouldn't it be interesting to know, imagination, if he was trying to earn a living by running some business? And if he was running a business, where would he go to do it? Wouldn't he contact his homeland, where he's got the contacts, where he's got the language? Is it possible? Remember, journalists in the old days used to ask questions. Is it possible that this man was involved in a business deal in Russia that alienated people, that seriously pissed them off? And that if it's true that there was a leak from the stockpile of nerve gas, as the Prime Minister says is possible, that those people decided to have a go at him? So I am not saying that that's the truth. I don't know what the truth is any more than you do, but nor do all those hacks on national newspapers, including, I'm sorry to say, The Guardian, who have done the most dangerous thing that hacks ever can do. They've moved in a herd. They're all running around. They're like cows. If you're walking across a field and meet a single cow, you're safe. A journalist on his own is usually safe. Once they start stampeding around in herds, they get dangerous. And it's awful. I mean, are you with me here? The collapse of journalism around that story. Why have we expelled 23 diplomats when the Prime Minister herself says there's an alternative explanation? I haven't seen a single report that's gone into it. That's really serious. Do you want to agree with me?
Yeah. What am I agreeing with?
There's been a basic collapse of journalism. All over.
Any second now, I think we'll go to the audience because I know you'll all have lots of questions. But before we get, we should say there are fantastic journalists who are still working, and so we should mention Carol Cadwallader of the Observer and the fact that she sort of broke open the Cambridge Analytica story. We should mention Millie Gentleman and the work that she's done on Windrush. We should mention Ian Combane and the work that he's done on the story that terminated yesterday with the apology to the person we sent back to being tortured in Libya. Yeah. So there's still good work being done.
There are lots of good journalists out there. It's funny, when this book was published, various old, it was like I said at the time, it was like shining a light on dark corner full of reptiles, which was these, not you, but some certain senior editors, the word Dacre comes to mind, started hissing and like this, how dare you write about us? And that was slightly frightening, actually. Dacre is just frightening. And, but in the background, masses and masses of journalists from this country and around the world saying, God, you got in touch. Saying, thank God you wrote that. It's the same here. I sit at my desk, I recycle this crap. I have no idea whether what I'm writing is true. But there are very good journalists out there trapped in bad organizations, not allowing them to do their work. And
the only thing that, before we started, we have a sort of slightly different view about social media, because the other thing I thought in writing this book is that now I'm not editing a paper. I mean, we know there's so much bad information on social media, but there's fantastic information on social media too, and medics and lawyers and police people and military people. I mean, there are so many people who have just decided, actually, I want to take this business of communication to my own hands, and quite often they are better than journalists and more knowledgeable and more expert.
No, you're right. We disagree.
But that is true. That's true.
Well, that was my other pump that you wouldn't let me get to. Is a few years ago, I went to listen to Tim Berners-Lee, who created the World Wide Web, and he was a man expressing considerable disappointment about the way that things had worked out. And he talked about how in the early days of constructing the web, or creating it, he could visualize a world of universal connectivity. This is the expression he uses. And that's there. But what has also emerged is something much more dangerous than that I think is more powerful. And there's an important point to make about this. So, ever since the Industrial Revolution, people in the developed world have been able to buy news that suited their prejudice. The World Wide Web, social media, allows people not just to consume the news that suits them, but to generate it. So then you get these information whirlpools. It ain't universal connectivity. So here are the racists fabricating racist news to be consumed by other racists, and round it goes. And here are the Catholics doing their bit, and here are the Trotskyites doing their bit, and then the people who believe the world is being controlled by the Illuminati. it's a kind of psychosis in these groups that has nothing to do with evidence. And the important point is, it's very easy to point at Brexit voters and Trump supporters and say, oh, what foolish people consuming all this falsehood. But it happens across the board. There are well-meaning Guardian readers producing and ingesting falsehood and enjoying every moment of it, and they get very, very upset if you try to separate them. So, for example, homeopathy. Repeatedly there have been solid experiments which say the medical value of homeopathy is placebo plus 0. But you try in my hometown down in Sussex, persuading the sandal-wearing Guardian readers who use homeopathic medicine that that's true. They are not interested in evidence. Or we had quite a rough bust-up, being attacked, where I wrote about a huge police operation into investigating sex trafficking. It had gone on for 6 months. It involved every police force in the country and various government ministries busting sex traffickers. And at the end of the operation, the then Home Secretary and a Chief Constable said, we've busted 536 of these people. And for various reasons, I was a bit suspicious of what they were saying. So I used the Freedom of Information Act to get the internal reports from the police inquiry. It's supposed to take 28 days to get something through on the Freedom of Information Act. It took 9 months. They were kicking and screaming and complaining. And when we got it, it showed that they hadn't found 531 sex traffickers. The biggest sex trafficking operation in the history of this country, 6 months, had found a total of 0. Not 1. Because women become prostitutes primarily because of poverty across the world. And lots of people choose to do something they don't want to do to earn a living. Some poor women choose to do something they don't want to do in order to send money back to their homes. Okay. There was a huge rumpus within the Guardian building because, understandably, a lot of people, including Guardian reading women, think no woman in her right mind would do that. It must surely be happening only because there's a man forcing her to, the sex trafficker. And I'm not saying that it has never happened that a woman's been forced into prostitution. I have actually somebody in my family tree who was forced into prostitution. Sure, it can happen, but that is not the core of what's going on with prostitution. Now, so first of all, there was an enormous opposition from within the office that we would publish this story, which is based on the police's own internal documents. It's not me having a drunken outburst. And then when we published it, an onslaught. How dare you deny the reality of sex trafficking? So I'm just trying to say, don't fall into the trap of imagining it's only the fools on the other hill who are engaged in this process. It seems to me that all of us are somewhat psychologically inclined to think that we know what we think, and we're all getting pulled into this poisonous world of information whirlpools on the internet. And part of, if we get round to solutions, is to become emotionally strong enough and intellectually capable of saying, actually, I just got that wrong. I need to change my mind.
Right, let's have some questions, and if they can be questions and not speeches, that would be even better. And I don't know if we have microphones or not. We don't have microphones, but yes, there's a microphone. A question here, yeah.
Thanks very much. Nick, we had 1.5 of the 3 pumps. We had propaganda and then something to do with social media, and I don't think we got to the 3rd, so please clarify for my
Okay, he did cause trouble there, I thought.
Well, that's his job.
So there was propaganda, then these information whirlpools, which I think generate more falsehood than the propaganda one, and then the mainstream media. But because of what I was talking about, the journalism are still the biggest single source of falsehood in this mass, in this information chaos. There's those 3. There's probably some other smaller ones. It did become confused.
Yes.
I wonder if we're at the medical sort of event. What do you think you could learn, or the journalistic world could learn from the medical profession, where they have Hippocratic oaths, they have referencing of articles? What do you think could enhance the quality of journalism that isn't necessarily intrinsic to journalists? There's a whole fact-checking system built into it.
I've got a thought. But
I think journalism could learn a lot from academia in general, and I think if what we're saying as journalists and taking into account everything that Nick has just said, so I think there is a problem that journalists have at the moment, and the problem is trust. So if you're saying we're over here and we're better, trust us, I don't think that works unless you can show your evidence. So I think the more that journalists can be much more open in their working, maybe sometimes before writing stories, telling readers what they're writing, get the help of readers, link to everything, footnote everything, be transparent about sources where you can. So I think that openness and rigor around academia is something that journalists could learn from. But
you know that all journalists have agreed a code of conduct, which was formerly the property of the Press Complaints Commission. And the first clause of that code of conduct requires news organisations to correct any information which they published which was false or misleading. A broad category, and correctly so. Now, if that code of conduct was honoured in practice by news organisations in this country, the entire field of public policy would change, and we wouldn't now be leaving the European Union. As it is, we have just this week missed a chance to try to generate the kind of trust that Alan's just talked about and to try to put news organisations back on the rails. And this is a complicated story. We might not have time to go into it, but the bottom line is that the Leveson report has been subjected to a campaign of precisely the kind of false and misleading information which makes the Leveson report necessary. And it's been particularly depressing. He doesn't know I'm going to say this, but it's all right. The Guardian, that did so much to support the victims of press abuse and to stand up against immoral, dishonest, criminal behaviour in other newspapers, has capitulated and crossed the line and joined the herd. And they were actually lobbying MPs on the basis of bad faith misinformation to stop Leveson being enacted. And so now look what you're left with. You're left with a code of conduct whose primary clause could make so much difference, which is not being implemented. Story after story, day after day. And while we're about it, Leveson offered a way round the biggest single obstacle to the freedom of press in this country, which is defamation law. And because he wanted to set up an independent arbitration system, and disputes about defamation or breach of privacy would be settled there, cheaply and quickly, without horrifying damages and horrifying legal costs. No, no, say the press, that smells of state regulation because there's a monitoring body in the background. Look what they've accepted. They've accepted that disputes of that kind should be settled by statutory regulation, by state-appointed regulators. Exactly the opposite of what they claim to want. They are now going through the courts instead of the arbitration scheme, where they're dealing with the Defamation Act, the Contempt of Court Act, the Official Secrets Act, the Human Rights Act, which defines breach of privacy. All of these acts were passed by politicians, governments, and they've opted for that instead of their own code of conduct. And furthermore, who is it that decides whether these newspapers have breached these acts? Judges. Who appoints the judges? The Lord Chancellor's Department. He's a member of the government. And they attacked Leveson as being some sort of state regulation. This is what we call falsehood. It's awful to see it happening, particularly awful to see The Guardian joining in. A real intellectual and moral capitulation by those newspapers. I expect it of the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail is vicious. It deals in falsehood more than any other newspaper. I actually proved it statistically in there, which was what made Dacre very angry. But you don't expect The Guardian or the upmarket papers to join in. But the bad newspapers want the right to control that regulator, which is what they're doing with Ipso, so that they can breach the code of conduct, which they themselves have written and which dishonestly they pretend to want to abide by. And in the cause of that, they're willing to put up with having to deal with statutory regulation with state-appointed judges. So there's the answer we could have had.
There's a microphone to...
Oh, it makes me quite angry.
So at the beginning, we were told that prevention is better than cure. And I'm sure we all agree with that. Makes sense. So in the spirit of prevention, what can we do in education to help people have the skills set to deal with information in a critical scientific way? And I guess I'm almost answering my question in saying, what can we do to improve scientific education so that people have the critical scientific thinking so that they can spot things? Oh yeah, that doesn't make sense. That's rubbish. That's the way scientists think. But unfortunately, that's not taught at all in schools.
Is there anybody on the platform running an educational institution?
Well, I mean, it's a kind of sort of dead word, but media literacy is something which I think is now essential and should be taught in schools so that people can be incredibly skeptical and critical of all the media they consume. I mean, it's quite interesting teaching here in Oxford, which I occasionally do, and you can have a class of very, very bright people, and you say, bring me a story that you found last week you found interesting, and we'll talk about it. And quite often they will bring stories, and you say, oh, that's really interesting. Where did that story come from? And they'll say, Facebook. And you'll say, yeah, okay, but where was it before it was in Facebook? And quite often they will look you blankly. They don't understand what the question is. They do not. It was just in Facebook. And these are people who are in Oxford University. And then you trace back the source of these pieces that they've brought you because they're interesting. And I mean, it's literally incredible that people would place trust in these pieces. But these are clever people here who are now incapable of querying the source of papers because it all arrives in a stream on these phones and it all looks the same. So I think there is an incredibly important issue of getting into the schools really young and teaching people how to handle the barrage of information that is going to come their way. Do you agree?
I do.
Good.
As ever. But I think that there's one other thing. If you lived in an imaginary world where we had more political power than we do, you would want to nationalize both Facebook and Google. These are arguably the two most greedy organizations in the history of mankind, also high up there among the most destructive. And specifically, it's those two organizations which are killing journalism in the developed world by stealing our two primary sources of income, selling hard copy papers and advertising. I think it's right, isn't it, that Google and Facebook are now taking 90% of new online advertising.
That may be fake news.
Oh, you reckon?
Well,
I read it in The Guardian.
They say, I mean, I've had this discussion with them. They say it's not true, but it's
pretty
it's a
massive.
lot. Steve, I can see a question there, but at the moment we've only had questions from men, so I'm going to ask a question there from somebody who's not a man.
Okay, so I'm a PR officer.
It's all right.
Actually, I'd call myself a press officer, but I would quite like you to find it in your heart to say something positive about us. Rory Collins started off by talking about MMR, and I work in science media relations, and they're an army of science press officers who are fighting for the truth every day about MMR, about HPV vaccine, about statins, about e-cigarettes, about climate change. So just looking forward in this landscape, I know it's easy to say journalists are all about the truth, but they're compromised by their structure. PR officers are all about lies. In the new landscape, you implied that they're all about pushing messages, pushing a press release that they want copy. But in this new landscape, couldn't we actually find that changing? That there are some journalists out to get the truth, and there are some press officers desperately trying to get the truth because they work for well-resourced organisations like the Wellcome Trust or all the universities who are putting out top-quality research and access to the best experts.
Yeah. So certainly it is not the case that all PR is bad. So there are organizations whose relationship to the world is essentially benign, they're doing good work, and they put out information about it. The difficulty, first of all, I'm not saying that all PR is lies. A rather small proportion of PR is lies. The point I was trying to make is that even if the PR is true, the problem is when the PR people decide what it is we should publish. And it's that structural imbalance between our resources becoming more and more depleted, so that your average, I actually got a local newspaper reporter to keep a diary of a week, and he was doing an average of 9.6 stories per day. So he's not checking anything. He's not going out into the community and finding what's out there. He's waiting, for example, for the local police to give him a story, for the local businesses to give him a story. It's an inversion of what should be happening. So it's the structural problem that's the big one. I don't disagree with you that within that structural problem, there can be occasions when a PR person and a journalist can work together to tell the truth on something which genuinely is justified in journalistic terms. But you can see that imbalance of power.
Yes, Steve Barnett, if you wave your hand. Yes.
Thanks. I would ask both of you a question about the culture of journalism in the UK. Because Nick, your book is essentially about print media, print/online. And I think it's important that we make a distinction between print and broadcast, which are some of the most trusted journalism in the UK. But you both had 40 years in an industry where the UK is now the least trusted, has the least trusted print journalism in the whole of Europe. And I'm not convinced it's only a structural thing. So I wanted to ask you both, to what extent you feel that in those 40 years there is something about the newsroom of particularly the national newspapers, not necessarily the local newspapers, but the national newspapers, beyond the economic and structural issues, where certain kinds of practices, theft of data, doorstepping, hacking phones, whatever, not just illegal but unethical, immoral, become kind of acceptable, even to the point where second book where
okay. Sorry, the mic went off for a second, but you're right.
Sorry, in Nick's second book, where the News of the World editor, Coulson, you're up in Edinburgh covering the Coulson trial, and as he walks past you, he whispers traitor. Mm-hmm. So this is a guy who's uncovered horrible practices in journalism, but is being called by one of the guys who he fingered a traitor because he has been a traitor to what Coulson understood journalism to stand for. That speaks to me about the culture of what he thought was right and proper rather than just structural issues. So I'd be really interested in what both of your reflections on whether things have changed in those newsrooms.
Well, Nick should talk about that, but you're quite right that the way that Nick was demonized, by the Murdoch press, obviously, but there was I remember a huge profile of Nick that appeared in the Daily Mail by Stephen Glover, who lives in this town, and the headline was "The Man Who Did for the British Press." So not the man who saved the British press or who exposed the ethical failings of the British press, but by writing about that, did for the British press. But you spent your 10 years of your life looking at this, so you should answer that question.
I think we should all, first of all, just take a moment to recognise that Stephen Glover is awful. Okay. The British press are different. In my theory, it's to do with train timetables, that you've got something like 60 million people crammed into this tiny space. And since the Industrial Revolution, it's been possible to reach all of them with an overnight train from London or Glasgow. So it's an incredibly fertile market. You compare it to the United States, which, whatever it was, 220 million people scattered across a huge area. You put a newspaper on a train at 10 o'clock in the evening in New York and head it westwards. 6 o'clock the next morning, it's in the middle of nowhere. So our market is dense. And for the quality press, that's not a big factor. We're trying to earn money, traditionally, by attracting advertising. But for the popular papers who are fighting for that incredibly rich market, it means that they're peculiarly intense in their competition. And that gets fed down from the proprietor through the editor. And there's always a regime of fear in these. I started off on the Sunday People. People shout at you all the time. It's horrible. And so the reporters go out there with this kind of ruthlessness, which is passed down. You've got to get that story before the other people. We have to sell more copies than them. That's where the money's coming from. Go, 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 go. So the whole thing becomes ruthless. And so criminal things are done, unethical things. But I think there's another element in there which it's hard to talk about without using the word dacre, but it's real malice. I mean, it's a genuine commitment to publishing stories that will help you to win an argument, regardless of whether or not they're true. So Brexit was a huge example of that. But when I was doing the book, I did a chapter on the Daily Mail, wittily called Mail Aggression. And there's just stunning examples of falsehood. This was in a period when they were particularly rabid about black people and migrants. I talked to a lot of people who'd worked for the Daily Mail. Every single one of them had an example of racism in the news judgment. So there was a senior executive there, who's now an even more senior executive on another newspaper, who would frequently ask reporters out in the field. The reporter would call in and say, oh, I'm at the scene of the murder, there's 2 people dead, there's somebody in hospital. And he would say, are they of the dusky hue? And if they were of the dusky hue, they didn't want the story, unless the story fitted into two ends of the spectrum. Really serious criminals the Daily Mail will publish that. Or people who are from an ethnic minority, but they're so short back and sides and well-behaved with a tie on their collar that they could almost be British, so we'll let them in. I mean, it was consistent racism over and over again. And the use of the N-word, commonly in the newsroom, really disgusting. So then that filters through to their coverage of migrants. So I pulled various stories out of a media database about migration that had been produced by the Daily Mail. And where possible, I checked them. So, for example, there was a report by the all-party parliamentary group on AIDS, who were dealing with a question that had been floated by tabloid newspapers. Well, it wasn't a question, an allegation, that asylum seekers were bringing AIDS into the country. And they did a detailed analysis and produced a report. And the Daily Mail reported that on the basis of this, it was true that asylum seekers were bringing AIDS into the country. And the only problem with that news report in the Daily Mail was that it was the precise opposite of what the all-party parliamentary group had found. So there's nothing to do with the truth. This is Paul Dacre, particularly. Editors imprint their personality on newspapers. And it's Dacre, a very dishonest, very aggressive man, twisting and turning the facts in order to win his argument about asylum seekers. So apart from the bullying ruthlessness, there is real malicious dishonesty in some of these newspapers. And if the House of Commons had been listening, if The Guardian had not betrayed us all, if perhaps we'd managed to get a Leveson regulator in place, a genuine independent regulator, independent of the state and of the newspapers, that required newspapers to correct falsehood, we might have gone forwards. But now instead we've gone back just this week. It's a depressing end.
Sarah in the front.
Just to return it perhaps to the things that Sir Rory was saying earlier about the medical side of this, in the sort of scenario that you're describing, Nick, where you've got newspapers virtually and reporters virtually overwhelmed in the system unable to cope with the amount of the Whirlpool information as well as all the rest of it. Yeah. What I'm wondering is, those whirlpools are sometimes made up of controversies. And you even have scientists or pseudo-scientists, as some people here would say, pitted against the others. Yeah. It's very hard for journalists to understand who is actually on the right side, who's telling the truth in that. Yeah. It takes a lot of time, and your point about time is absolutely correct. But in a breaking story, you don't have time, but breaking stories still have to be done. I'm wondering if you think that there is something to be done by people within the establishment, medical establishment, scientific establishment as well, to validate or in some way grade the information that's coming out. And you can talk about peer-reviewed journals, but actually there are lots of those and some are better reviewed than others, frankly. What can you do actually for people in that area, those fields, to help us, if you like, to find out the truth of these stories?
But do you mean that they would peer review or grade material coming out of the academic world, or coming out of any part of the scientific world?
No, I suppose what I'm asking for is whether there's any way that they can help us by either getting the story straight between themselves. I mean, I can name any number of controversies where you've had what looked like decent scientists on both sides, or in some way say this journal is better than that one, this paper is better than that one, and so on.
Well, so I wonder if there isn't a future model which does work on that thought, that you have journalists who admit the fact that they can't get out in the world and find stories and check facts the way they used to. So instead they become more like curators. And as curators, they reach out to those organizations that still do have the resources as well as the skills to provide some kind of reliable information. So that might be NGOs as well as the academic world. I don't know, there are probably other sources out there. So there was a point when Alan was still editor, when I was trying to persuade the head of news to do that with poverty. Poverty, 13 million people living in this country below the poverty line. Amelia Gentleman, the only reporter in Fleet Street covering it. And so couldn't we set up a chunk of the website where the specialist academics who study poverty could post their material, and the curator can extract the headlines and guide readers through it.
Which we did with climate change.
Yes, although somebody stopped the campaign after you left.
But I mean,
but you know
the idea of
that the newspaper becomes curator.
Yeah.
because we acknowledge that we've no longer got the resources to go out and find it. You could do that in all sorts of areas, and it could be interesting. They could have done it with Brexit. It would have been fantastic, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but this is the sort of slight disagreement, because I think those people are there. You know, I follow on Twitter lots of lawyers.
Yeah.
And they are, you know, they're lawyers. They know what they're talking about. And they talk about the law fantastically, knowledgeably and confidently. And sometimes you find them staying up till midnight because they know a dodgy legal story is going to be appearing in a paper. And by midnight, they've exposed the failings in the story, and they've posted the quotes, and they've done the screen grabs.
But are we on the same track as said that you can be doing that on the website of the news organisation?
Yes, no,
not on Twitter?
I think harnessing the best of those people and sort of pulling them onto your news site and saying, actually, we do this together. But you look sceptical.
It's just figuring out which ones are telling the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your point, who is telling the truth?
Yeah.
You don't have the time necessarily to look into it.
Yeah.
Is there anybody up there? Oh, there's some hands up there. Is it possible to get a microphone up?
There's a guy. Can you see there's a guy?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Would you agree with me that the left has been so successful in shutting down the English liberty for freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of assembly, that journalism and our ability just to express ourselves as English people has really suffered? In yesterday's paper, they're talking about charging people who share what they call hate. We never defined material, and we have a situation now where if you believe something which is against the establishment, which they call it populist, you're made to feel like it's something completely beyond the pale.
This is the left, you're saying?
Yes, do you feel that the left have been so successful in shutting down by using terms like hate?
I'm happy to answer. The people on the left, for centuries, sacrificed their time and energy and liberty and sometimes lives in order to create a collection of human rights and civil liberties. Don't tell me it's the left that's taking away people's freedom of speech. It's people on the left who fought for that. It's those repressive people on the right who love to hate progressives and liberals and trade unionists who would try and close it down. But perhaps this is drifting rather away from falsehood in the media. No, don't know. Come on, let's move on. There was somebody on your right who wanted a question as well.
Thank you. Okay, hi. As you mentioned earlier regarding newspapers engaging in criminal activity for profit, if we look at stories like Hillsborough and the complete kind of alienation of an entire city, i.e. Liverpool, specifically towards the Sun, surely that's counterproductive for journalism as a whole to be reporting on things so atrocious that you've then alienated your profit source.
Yes. Well, so the Hillsborough coverage by the Sun was the work of one Kelvin Mackenzie. I think everybody in this room would agree that if you're looking for a model for a decent journalist, it ain't Kelvin. He's a disaster area, and he has the shame of Hillsborough hanging around his head forever. Not even the Sun will use him now. So he's an outlier. I don't think he tells you very much. But I don't think that takes away from the central proposition that it's the commercial drive which is pushing media organizations forward rather than an honest journalistic one.
Again, well, there's a microphone up in that sort of general zone there. We're going to have to stop in about 5 minutes, so
Hi, thanks very much. I just wanted to ask you whether you feel the appetite for truth in the media is there amongst the public. When you think about the Daily Mail is one of the most popular news websites on the planet, but you think about what sorts of articles, what quality of articles are on there. To what extent are we even able to get the public caring about well thought through, considered journalism? Is the appetite even there for that anymore?
Yeah. I think there's been a sort of tectonic shift culturally in my life. So in the 60s and 70s, it was commonplace to hear people identifying themselves in more or less political terms. I'm a trade unionist, I'm working class. Whereas once everything starts to change from April 79, you have a world now in which people identify themselves more as consumers. I'm saving for my holidays. You don't hear people talking in those terms. And I think beyond that, there's a feeling that the world has got so complicated, so beset by problems, that the political world is so cynical and so unlikely to solve those problems that, what's the point? What's the point of reading a paper? Why would you try and understand? Let's just go on holiday. Let's forget it. So I think that it's a really worrying underlying trend because, of course, it's self-fulfilling. The more that people drift away from public debate and political activism, the easier it is for the cynics to run the show. But you can see quite a powerful undertow in that direction.
I've got the microphone, actually,
okay.
so I don't know if I can pull rank on that one. So I wonder if either of you have insight into why The Guardian, and I guess the FT as well, sold Leveson down the river.
I don't know about, I don't really know. I think probably, I don't know because I'm out of touch because I retired 2 years ago, but my sense is I think that the paper had got pretty exhausted by fighting with the rest of Fleet Street. Maybe there was the kind of thing about, well, let's try and make some peace. I know on the commercial side that things are so desperate that they've had to form an organization where the Murdoch papers and The Guardian and everybody else is all in there together trying to sell online advertising space. That may have been a factor. I think there's a slight tendency at The Guardian. I mean, why did they stop the... Right, this is getting a bit controversial. But Alan was trying to save the planet by dealing with climate change while he was editor. And then he left and they stopped. You see this quite often with organizations. The new people come in and they just kill off what was going on before simply because it was going on before. And I wonder whether there was a bit of that going on. The phone hacking's connected with Alan. And we don't want to be part of anything.
Let's change the subject. There's a question right out there.
Yeah. Very short question, but I wonder what things have got better since the 1970s and 80s. You know, it's more diverse, there's more women now, I guess there's less alcohol, but there must be other things that have got better in journalism.
Yeah, well, so one thing is that if you're going to be chained to a keyboard and sit at your desk all day, the amount of information which you can access is far, far greater than it used to be. That's an enormous step forward. The public domain is far bigger than it was before. That's the information you can get simply because you try and find it. So that's a huge leap forward, no question. I would say that global communications, global transport also make it easier if you've got some money in your pocket to go out and find stories and research them.
And I think, I suppose my job is to occasionally jump in and say that there is fantastic journalism going on. I mean, the response to Trump in America has by and large been magnificent. And the so-called Trump bump in subscriptions to the papers that have done the best reporting, which I think has reminded people of why journalism exists and why journalism has to exist and why journalism should exist. And there are reporters who are rising magnificently to that challenge. So I think, we shouldn't get ourselves in a position where we sort of beat up the profession in general. And Nick's already made the point that actually his target is not journalists, many of whom agreed with Nick and share his diagnosis, but it's the structural situation which we're really talking about. So we've got perhaps two more questions. There's one hand there, and one hand over there. Okay.
So I've worked a little bit with politicians, with journalists, with PR people, with academics, with business leaders. So you can see I can't make my mind up, but all of them seem to be generally trying to do the right thing and trying to get through the end of the week. And all of them look at each other and see that they're trying to get to the end of the week rather than they're trying to do the right thing. And all of them justify to themselves why they're trying to do the right thing. And so we've got this kind of spiraling down of trust across all of these. Can you present a vision for how we could actually reward each other for doing the right thing? Can you see a world where politicians are rewarded for actually speaking truth, where journalists are rewarded for doing the right thing, where PR people are actually applauded when they try and get the right message out? And if not, what hope is there?
Well, I'm on the gloomy side. You've always been more optimistic than me. Can you see that? No, can we see a world in which people are rewarded for doing their job well and telling the truth? We seem to have passed that point, haven't we? No, I feel very pessimistic. No, I haven't got anything intelligent to say about that, as you can see. Sorry.
Question over there.
Hi, I mean, you've been talking about false news or sort of untruths in the news, but then that also brings out the possibility, or brings out the actuality that when things are true in the news, that people don't actually believe them. Mm-hmm. And so it seems that those are really two sides of the same, two sides of the same problem, is that the lack of belief in something that's true is almost is as bad as the belief in something that's false.
Yes.
And I just wondered how you can help people to understand what's true and what's false.
Well, this is the frustrating thing about these information whirlpools, that there are more and more people who are saying to themselves, here's a factual statement. And what they should be saying is this statement supported by evidence? Instead of which they say, do I like this statement? Does it suit the things that I previously believed? And then they adopt it, regardless of evidence. And what's scary is that a decent newspaper or the academic world or whatever can present that person with the clearest possible evidence, and they will cling to the falsehood because it suits them. That was what I was trying to describe earlier on. And I'm putting the scale on which that kind of approach generates falsehood on the media as beyond what's produced by government and intelligence agencies producing propaganda. It's terrifying. And then us lot, pumping falsehood out, failing to check, and being manipulated. It's those three things together.
I think there's a final question here.
Let's end with a joke. It's a bit gloomy.
Might be. I mean, it's you mentioned Kelvin Mackenzie, you mentioned Paul Dacre, both justifiably, but you mentioned curiously little about the Murdoch family. You know, father, son, and grandfather, for that matter. Yeah. I mean, are they a particular reason for how things have gone in this country, do you think? Or would it just have been more or less as bad as this anyway?
I think that Murdoch embodies the new generation of media owners. It's something that outsiders sometimes get wrong, that if you go back to the period between the wars, you have a generation of media owners here and in the United States embodied by Beaverbrook and Randolph Hearst. And these are people who are quite overtly propagandists. Beaverbrook said, I own newspapers for the sake of propaganda. But what happens then is after the war, these newspapers are making a lot of money. And so they attract a different kind of owner. And Murdoch is that. Murdoch is a corporate owner. He wants to make money. I was in a debate a bit like this once, just talking about Murdoch. And the question was, is he primarily interested in power or money? And I come down heavily on the side of money. I mean, I think the man has got a bit of a personality problem. He can't stop trying to accumulate it. The power is obtained in order to make even more money. And if you talk to people who know Murdoch well, they will tell you that his politics are so right-wing, they're laughable, they're absurd. He likes to tell disgusting jokes about gay men. Michael Wolff quotes a few in his book about Murdoch. But he on the whole, doesn't put his politics into his newspaper because he just wants to make money. So he embodies the invasion of newsrooms by the logic of commercialism, which then unfolds with all sorts of damage done. If I was really... Oh, no, I don't think I can find it. There were some good quotes about... So there was a quote from Murdoch. There's a particularly complex story which is on its way into one of the quality newspapers in the UK that he owns, and he's in the newsroom, and he says, I don't want any of that upmarket shit in my paper. There you go. That sounded more like Michael Caine than Rupert Murdoch. You get the idea. That's what he stands for. We ended on a joke.
We ended on a joke.
Did I embarrass you?
You did very well.
So I don't know if I've still got a mic on, but I do want to thank Alan and Nick. I think we know a little bit more about the causes of the problem. I'm not actually convinced we know very much more about how to prevent or treat the problem. And really the issue is it's an uneven fight between truth and the other side. Because if you're not constrained by truth, it's a hell of a lot easier to win your argument. So thank you very much, Nick and Alan.